All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a really hard, evidence-based look at the youth sports machine. Look, if you have ever spent a freezing Saturday morning huddled on the sidelines of a youth tournament, or, maybe you've just wondered why so many of these early phenoms completely burn out before they even hit high school, well, you are definitely in the right place. We are going to unpack exactly why our traditional systems for developing young athletes are, quite frankly, fundamentally broken. But more importantly, we're going to explore how modern sports science actually offers us a completely different and vastly more effective path forward.
Okay, let's dive into this with a quote that just perfectly sets the stage for everything we're about to talk about. This is from the legendary former U.S. men's national team goalkeeper Tim Howard. He said, "The system doesn't operate in a way that allows for young soccer players to develop. I lived it, I'm a soccer dad, I lived in Europe, so I've seen it all. We don't develop our players at any type of good rate." Wow, that is a visceral, completely unfiltered critique from someone who has literally reached the absolute pinnacle of the sport, and he's pointing straight at a massive systemic failure.
And that critique brings us right to this glaring, almost unbelievable paradox. Think about it. The United States has practically unmatched financial resources. We have world-class facilities popping up everywhere and literally millions upon millions of kids playing youth sports. So why on earth aren't we producing world-class talent at a rate that actually matches that massive player pool? Whether we're talking about soccer, basketball, hockey, you name it, the drop-off in elite talent is just staggering.
So, to figure out why that's happening, we kind of have to look at the underlying structure itself. Once kids hit about 11 or 12 years old, they're thrust into what is fiercely marketed as competitive sports. But what's really happening on the ground is this massive clash of two totally different models. On one side, you have the reality, which is the business model. It's built entirely on tiers, divisions, and rankings. The absolute obsession is winning right now. Because let's be real, winning is what justifies those thousands of dollars in travel fees, the endless hotel stays, and the elite club dues. But on the other side is what an actual development model is supposed to look like, where you prioritize technical skill, tactical understanding, and genuine creativity. But in our current ecosystem, true development almost always takes a backseat to revenue and prestige.
And because winning today is the main metric for a club's business success, coaches end up taking what we call the shortcut. Think about it. To win a game at age 12, the fastest, easiest method is super simple. Just recruit the biggest, strongest, fastest kids you can find. Coaches lean heavily on these early, physical bloomers who can completely dominate a game purely on sheer athleticism. We all know the ones, the kids who can just boot the ball past everyone else just because they're a foot taller. But here's the catch. Taking this shortcut actively stunts long-term growth. The smaller, highly technical, and honestly often more creative players, the ones who desperately need the space to make mistakes and try new things, they get sidelined. Or worse, they get cut. The system basically rewards physical dominance in the short term, but it completely ignores the sports intelligence needed for the long haul.
Now, what's really interesting about all this is that the academic data completely 100% backs up this frustration. We're not just talking about angry parents venting in the parking lot. This is hard, peer-reviewed science. For instance, the Journal of Expertise published this massive multi-year study where they evaluated the developmental pathways of elite soccer players. They wanted to see exactly what separates the kids who actually make it to the adult professional level from the ones who eventually just plateau.
And what the researchers identified is something they call the early majority engagement pathway. This is basically the scientific consensus on how expert athletes actually develop in the real world. Now, yes, successful pros absolutely engage heavily in their chosen sport from an early age. That's the majority engagement part. But critically, and this is huge, they don't just grind endlessly through structured, coach-led robotic drills. Instead, they balance that formal practice with incredibly high volumes of self-directed, totally unstructured play. We're talking backyard games, kicking a ball against a brick wall for hours on end, or, chaotic 3-on-3 pickup games at the local park.
The data here is literally an absolute smoking gun. When the researchers grouped these players by their final career stages, this incredibly clear pattern emerged. The players who reached the absolute highest tier, the adult pros, spent a vastly greater proportion of their childhood in unstructured play, compared to the ones who stalled out. Whether players peaked at the youth academy level or the youth professional level, the main differentiating factor was simply how much time they spent just playing freely. The kids who only focused on high-volume, highly structured practice, they simply didn't make the final cut.
So we have to ask, why is that? What exactly is the magic of unstructured play? Well, it's all about what happens when the adults finally step away.
Pickup games in the streets or at the park happen in incredibly variable, unpredictable conditions. There are no referees, no rigid formations, and most importantly, there is absolutely zero fear of a coach benching you for making a mistake. This kind of environment naturally encourages massive risk-taking. Players try that crazy impossible pass, or they attempt some wildly inventive dribble, and by doing that, they're building the foundational perceptual and cognitive skills that rigid, win-at-all-costs environments actively destroy. I mean, it's exactly how the unstructured, chaotic environment of street soccer helped build absolute legends like Pelé and Ronaldinho.
Let's move to the science and see how this builds into something we can actually use. How do we translate that street ball magic into organized coaching? Well, researchers have embraced this really fascinating framework called ecological dynamics. Championed by figures like Professor Keith Davids, this theory completely challenges everything traditional coaching relies on. It shifts the focus away from those rigid, isolated, repetitive drills, the ones where kids just stand in lines, and instead it emphasizes the dynamic, living interaction between the athlete and their environment. The core idea is that athletes are not robots just following pre-programmed commands. They self-organize naturally to solve movement problems in real time.
To truly understand how that works, we have to grasp something called perception-action coupling. Now, I know that sounds like a mouthful of academic jargon, but stick with me, it's vital. It basically means that players don't just store a perfect technique in their brain and then press play like a videotape when the ball arrives. Instead, they're constantly reading the live game. What they perceive in that moment directly informs what they do, and then what they do immediately changes what they perceive next. It's this continuous, unbreakable loop. If you train a player in an isolated drill with 0 defenders, you are completely severing that loop. You're basically teaching action without any perception.
So the crucial point is that we literally have to change how we view the entire role of the coach. In this new framework, a coach's real job is to design practices that present varied affordances. And an affordance is simply an opportunity for action. That's it. A gap between 2 defenders. That's an affordance to pass. A defender leaning slightly the wrong way. That is an affordance to drive to the basket. The coach's job is to create these rich environments where players are constantly forced to recognize and instantly act upon these live, fleeting opportunities.
And that brings us to the practical application of all this science, the constraints-led approach, or CLA for short. If ecological dynamics is the grand theory, CLA is the actual playbook for how you run your Tuesday night practice. The goal is beautifully simple. Bring the chaos, the unpredictability, and the true representative nature of a live match right into everyday training. We're talking about moving way beyond the traditional cones and lines.
Okay, but how do you actually pull that off? Well, it boils down to 5 core principles. First up, practice has to actually look and feel like the real game. That's called representative learning design. Second, instead of just barking commands from the sideline, coaches change the rules or alter the space to naturally shape behavior. That's manipulating constraints. This naturally leads right into number 3, encouraging players to explore and find their own creative movement solutions. Fourth, when coaches do speak, they use external feedback. For example, you tell a player to shoot the ball over the defender's reach rather than saying bend your knees more. You focus on the outcome, not the internal mechanics. And finally, task simplification. If an exercise is just too hard, you don't remove the opponent entirely. You just tweak the constraints slightly to help the player find success.
And this brilliantly illustrates what the whole process looks like step by step for a coach. Step 1, you set up a live environment. We're talking real defenders, real pressure. Step 2, you manipulate a constraint. Maybe you say the offense only gets 3 touches, or maybe you narrow the physical space of the field. This makes certain affordances, like quick passing, much more attractive to the players. And then, step 3, you step back. You actually allow the players to discover the solutions organically. You're guiding their discovery by shaping the environment around them rather than just prescribing a rigid, one-size-fits-all robotic technique.
I mean, the contrast here literally couldn't be starker, right? Traditional coaching treats the coach as the master instructor, demanding these rigid techniques through isolated, dead drills. But the ecological framework, it treats the coach as a guide, fostering adaptable, live exploration. Now, I need to make something absolutely clear here. The ecological approach is definitely not just some random chaotic free-for-all. Actually, scratch that, it's the exact opposite. It is a highly deliberate, scientifically proven method of guided discovery. The coach is still entirely in control, but they're controlling the environment, not trying to operate the player like a joystick.
Which kind of brings us to the toughest part of this explainer. This is a direct, honest message for the parents out there. Look, we see the sacrifices you make, the sheer amount of money, the countless weekends in cheap hotels, the endless hours of driving. We know it comes from a place of deep love and a desire to give your kid the absolute best pathway possible. But you really have to ask yourself, is chasing the prestige of an elite badge at age 12
actually serving their long-term development, or is it just feeding a really lucrative business model? Are your kids allowed to play freely and joyfully, or are they already being suffocated by the heavy pressure of adult expectations?
So, I want to leave you with this final, really provocative thought. Are we trying to build trophy winners at 14, or are we trying to develop professionals at 20? Because right now, our youth sports system is heavily incentivized to do the former, and it's happening at the direct expense of the latter. If we want to truly tap into the potential of our athletes, we have to stop optimizing for this weekend's meaningless tournament. We have to embrace the actual science of how humans learn and give our kids the freedom to play, to fail, and ultimately to discover their own greatness. Thanks for joining us for this explainer. We'll see you next time.